Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Georgian Alumni Speaker Series. My name is David Bell. I'm the Associate Vice President of Advancement and Alumni Relations here at Georgian College. Delighted to be hosting this additional installment of our Alumni Speaker Series, which launched first in 2020 to bring a new type of programming to our global alumni family. Since that time, we hold a new episode every other month, or monthly if we can, featuring talented alumni and our Georgian faculty experts teaching in the classroom every day. And tonight we're in for a real treat. I want to start off this evening by thanking all of the alumni and friends who have joined us from all over the world, and remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available via our alumni website in the on-demand recording section of our events page. Housekeeping items before we begin. We have reserved space for questions and answers after our keynote speaker has finished his talk, and you can post your questions in the chat. And Taylor Woods, our Alumni Engagement Associate, will be monitoring the chat throughout the discussion, and we'll be able to pose those questions to our speaker at the end of the workshop. To do at all Georgian events, I'll now speak to our land acknowledgement. As this event is virtual and we have alumni and friends from all over the globe tuning in, I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. I'd like to add that I am not Indigenous, rather I am a settler here. Although my heritage extends to other countries, I, like many other settler people, have benefited greatly from living in Simcoe County. We all have an important responsibility to acknowledge the grounds on which we are privileged to gather in the pursuit of higher education. Our college acknowledges that all campuses are situated on the traditional land of the Anishinaabeg people. The Anishinaabeg include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. Georgian College is dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Now I invite my colleague, Kelly Pottage, our Associate Director of Engagement, to introduce our guest speaker. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks, David. I'm really honored to get to introduce Ross tonight. Ross is the Program Coordinator for Computer Programming, Lakehead Georgian Partnership, Faculty Lead Researcher Technology and Visual Arts, Georgian College. That's his title, but let me tell you a little bit about him. Ross has taught and coordinated technology programs for over 20 years. Prior to coming to Georgian College, he held roles including IT Manager, Director of Online Learning, and Chief Information Officer. While at Georgian, Ross has coordinated 5 programs in the Computer Studies portfolio and has been very active in developing new programs, including mobile application development, big data analytics, computer science through a partnership with Lakehead, artificial intelligence, and game design and simulation. He holds 3 diplomas in engineering technology, a Bachelor of Technology, and a Master of Science. As a faculty lead researcher, Ross's research explores ways to build smarter, more connected products, and is leveraging AI systems to help companies become market leaders with Industry 4.0 solutions. Some recent projects include a smart wearable for families impacted by autism spectrum disorder, an educational device that makes it easier to learn how to code in a fun and kinesthetic way, and an AI-controlled agricultural and lighting system designed to promote maximum crop yield in an energy-efficient and predictable manner. When he's not helping students or spending time with his kids, Ross also enjoys working with the Henry Bernick Entrepreneurship Center, helping entrepreneurs leverage technology to achieve their business goals. Over to you, Ross.
Well, thank you, Kelly. So it's a wonderful to be able to spend some time and share this awesome technology with you, and hopefully provide a few enlightenments on how it works and kind of separate out the how it works, why we can use it, how we can use it from sort of the hype that we're seeing on the news reels and on social media about sort of AI taking over the world, and sort of also talk a little about the limitations and what it does well and what it doesn't do well, and sort of where we should consider using it in other areas where we shouldn't. So this is sort of our agenda for this talk, and this will make a lot more sense as we go through the slides in the next half hour to 45 minutes. So I was sort of taught that when there's an elephant in the room, let's address it head on and talk directly and frankly about it, because at some point people are going to realize there's an elephant in the room. So generative AI will transform every industry. We are seeing it, people talking about it, figuring out what it means to them, and sort of where things are going in the next few years. Generative AI is a technology that anyone can and will use to create content. And that's really what technologies like ChatGPT are. They're content creation tools. And what's kind of discerning, especially among some of my faculty colleagues, is we will not be able to reliably detect what was created by a human versus an AI, which causes all sorts of academic integrity concerns and things like that. And then also we're seeing that current technology could already impact a significant number of jobs across all industry sectors. I mean, a couple of estimations I've seen is somewhere between 20 to 30% of jobs can be augmented by artificial intelligence, whether it's ChatGPT or other tools, and sort of what that potentially means. And that's sort of what I think every business and sector leader is sort of asking themselves, struggling with, trying to figure out, where do we go from here? And I mean, really, what will the workforce landscape look like in the next 2 years? And I don't think anyone really has a good, solid answer for that. The fact is, we know it's going to be different. We know there's going to be AI. How is that going to impact our sector, and how is that going to be received and used and adopted by our stakeholders? And when we talk specifically about ChatGPT and some of the things that it's already done in the short 4 months that it's been around, we're seeing things like the SATs, where it's placing in the top 5% in the reading and writing categories. Mathematics is easy for computing, right? It's very logical, very linear. We've been doing mathematics on computers for decades and decades now. Trying to understand, interpret, and create natural language is a very difficult thing for machine learning to do. We've also seen it pass the bar exam in the top 10%. So that's so what is that going to mean in the legal sector? How can lawyers incorporate, not just lawyers, but judges and plaintiffs, defendants, utilize this technology in court proceedings and other legal contracts, right? And we've also seen it try to break up a marriage. There was an incident where basically Microsoft has acquired the rights to ChatGPT, and they sort of, I think in a rush to get it to market, put it out in their Bing chat. And there was a big difference between what we know as ChatGPT and Bing chat, in that Bing was kind of open up to the full internet. There was a limitation on some of the safeguards that OpenAI originally put into it. And it was, we'll talk about it in a few slides, but basically ChatGPT thought the journalist was trying to create a story. So it essentially tried to convince the journalist to leave his wife and marry the AI instead. So we can kind of see things on the positive spectrum and also some of the consequences and things that we really need to make sure that especially our vulnerable populations are aware of. So with all of that sort of as our foundation, let's just start right from the beginning and talk about what is generative AI. And generative AI is basically any system that uses AI that can create text and images, generally in response to prompts created by humans, but it's kind of interesting because you can actually have one AI system create an image and text, and then kind of have the input of one tied to the output of another, and kind of daisy chain them along, where you provide a prompt and you get a response, and then that response generates an image, and that image maybe creates a sound or a song even. So generative AI models basically learn the patterns and structure through their training data, and then they create new data sets that has similar characteristics. In the case of ChatGPT, I sort of use the term make stuff up, because that's literally what's happening. It is combing through its data sets, and based on the prompt that you give it, it's trying to create something that's net new, following the patterns that are sort of gleaned from your prompt that was provided. Okay. So when we talk about from the lens of generative AI, the whole world is data, and whether that is an image or video or sound or text, these types of models are basically capable of creating any combination and permutation of this. And I mean, we're certainly seeing deep fake videos where anybody who is a public figure, where there's enough images and video, you can actually stitch together pretty convincing voice and video of things that never happened, right? So it's going to be very interesting to see how can we discern what's really happening versus what was created as kind of a storytelling approach. Now, before we get too much deeper into this, I want to kind of link it back to something that most of you are probably familiar with. We've had search engines now with us for about 20 years, and certainly Google is the big market leader, right? As of this year, they have like 93% of market share, followed by Microsoft being at 3% and a number of others. So a search engine's job is to basically organize information. In fact, that's sort of Google's mission, is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible by all. So that is significantly different when we talk about things like ChatGPT. And this is sort of one of the mistakes I sort of see people when they first start playing around with the technology. They're expecting kind of search engine type results. They're expecting knowledge back, right? They're providing an input, they're creating a prompt, and there's instances where you can ask a simple mathematical equation and ChatGPT just makes up an answer, right? That isn't actually the answer. Well, it does that with facts and things like that. So those aren't good use cases for this technology. And it's sort of by design, it's intended to be what's called a conversational model. The idea is that it's generating net new text in a conversational type form, whereas a search engine, you're going off and you're searching for specific pieces of knowledge out on the internet, and then when you get back is a wide variety of answers, and then kind of you as the person have to discern, is this a credible source? Yes or no, right? Is this someone's personal blog? Is it a news site? Is it an academic paper? What is the actual source? None of that actually happens when you use these generative models. The whole model is simply, if you ask it to tell you a story, it will tell you a story, right? If you ask it to make something up, it will make something up. When you ask it to do something and you're very vague and ambiguous, it doesn't really ask for clarification in its current version, right? It just sort of tries to interpret what it thinks you're looking for and feed into those answers. Okay, so there's a big difference between search engine, and if we talk about now what is GPT, right? So the GPT architecture has actually been around for about 5 years, and when GPT-3 was kind of released, or ChatGPT, in November of last year, when it sort of started making headlines and getting on everyone's radar, that version of the model was actually already 2 years old. And so that model that they've kind of been tuning it, optimizing it, refining it, doing some quality checks. And really the goal in releasing it the way that OpenAI did was to see how people would interact and sort of crowdsource a large data volume to see how people would interact with these types of models. Now, you've probably seen that diagram that I have on the right there in a few places, and it's generally used to represent what's called a neural network. And when we talk about a neural network, it's a form of machine learning. And the easiest way to describe it to sort of anybody is it's like a decision tree, right? So ChatGPT basically is 175 billion decision points that are nested in about 2,000 layers. So as it's kind of going through these decision points, and every layer that it goes through, it kind of looks back to the previous layer and says, did I make the right decision? Do I go this way or do I go that way? Is this a better answer? Is that a better answer? Is this what you're looking for? Or is that what you're looking for? That's essentially what this model is, right? Now, GPT-4 was just released about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago. OpenAI has been pretty quiet with the exact parameters in terms of size, but there's a lot of data scientists out there that are sort of estimating it's about 100 times greater than GPT-3. So this is a massive, massive decision tree that when you combine that type of decision logic with a very, very large data set, and that's kind of what the graphic is in the bottom corner, you can see that OpenAI used like 410 billion data tokens, if you will. Now a token is basically, the easiest way to describe it is a word. So it's kind of a computer science way of storing information. And so a token roughly equates to a word, but things like punctuation and contractions also count as a token. So it's not quite exactly that many words, but basically OpenAI went out and harvested 410 billion words from web crawls along with the context of that information, because that's really what's important. Because when we talk about styles of writing and information exchange, how we message on a web board or a discussion forum on Reddit is significantly different than how we write an academic paper. So all of that was kind of part of the common web crawl. A number of books, the entire Gutenberg library was parsed out, like the entire works of William Shakespeare, all of Wikipedia. That was kind of the nucleus of the original foundation for what's called the training data. Okay, so your training data, when you have a large data set combined with a very large neural network, is kind of why ChatGPT can do what it does, right? Where it basically, when you provide a prompt, your prompt is going through this neural network and it's basically trying to figure out what is the best response, right? Again, based on the training data that was provided. And there is actually, and have been for a number of years, a large team of human labelers. And those human labelers' job is to basically rank, classify, and identify new prompts, if you will, for the neural network. So this has been going on behind the scenes for a number of years now. And so when we sort of look at the scope and size and you start thinking about all the things that have gone in to train this model, it is very, very comprehensive, right? So I mean, the entire works of William Shakespeare, every programming language under the planet, all of the reference material and sub-libraries. I did a lot of probing on some very obscure programming languages, some of them that really haven't been used in 50 years. And the model is very much aware of all of these languages and can actually program and code in them. Now, it's not going to give you an entirely functioning application, but through a conversation, if you know what to ask for, it can build those little snippets and start to create those little modules for you. And I've actually created a couple of applications end to end using this model. Okay, and then we also have all the world's academic paper, textbooks, novels, and that again speaks to what you're going to get back. If the model thinks you're looking for a story, it's going to tell you a story. If it thinks you're looking for like a textbook response, it will give you a textbook response. But there is a lot of, it's not 100%, and there is a lot of room for ambiguous conversation, and we have that ourselves, even as humans, to make sure that we understand the context and relevance of everything that is being exchanged through communication. And a lot of our communication is nonverbal. So the translation or the meaning or the interpretation of it doesn't always follow kind of what's in the dictionary and thesaurus. So these are kind of where you kind of get really off the rail answers from these types of models. Then you also have things like the world's knowledge base, legislation transcripts, legal archives, all those types of things. So if you want to, for example, create a legal version of ChatGPT, you might exclude all the Reddit forum posts and focus in on just, hey, we're only really concerned about the legal space, right? So take all the transcripts from everything that's been said in all the different courts of law around the world, all the patent applications, contract law, and it's really good at finding things that are related to those topical areas. Okay. So again, kind of in summary, GPT is not a search engine, and absolutely do not treat it like this, because you can get very incorrect and sometimes harmful replies. And sort of a quote right from the CEO of OpenAI was, it's spitting out words and not knowledge, because it's looking for and trying to mimic a response that it expects, right? Because it's a conversation. So it's sort of like role playing, right? You tell this model, hey, I want you to be an old friend that we go back 20 years and we had these experiences. It will mimic that. If you tell it to behave like a lawyer, it will mimic that. It will not give you the facts and figures and those sort of things. Now, this space is actually very crowded, and it's not just ChatGPT, although that's the main focus of what we're doing, because that's sort of what everybody's heard of. But there's so many models from basically all the big tech players. Apple has kind of been a little closed on what they're doing, but there is a number, like Baird is Google's version. There's Llama from Meta, right? And then there's a couple of open source ones like Bloom. DeepMind is a think tank, kind of like OpenAI, and they have Gopher. And so these are all models that do relatively the same thing, and that is create content based on a prompt and using training data as the original source. Okay, so some of the limitations that I've already spoke with actually some of these I've mentioned already, is it will give you things that sound plausible but are totally incorrect and nonsensical, right? Basically that whole make stuff up, right? And it doesn't really segregate or identify the source of truth, which means depending on how the model interprets your prompt, it may give higher priority to something from Reddit over Wikipedia over WebMD, which, I mean, do not use this to try and get medical advice. That's just a really, really bad idea. So training data can actually skew or bias the data, because the model is going to return results based on what it knows about, what information was provided as the original training set. And that's where we kind of come in and hone down, depending on the application. There's going to be very specific versions of these models for different use cases across the sector. It's not going to be kind of this all-encompassing, all-in-one machine learning AI model that just kind of does everything. There's going to be sector-specific nuances that are basically influenced by the training data that's provided. And so the OpenAI version is very sensitive to how you phrase things, and it's also very sensitive to tweaks that you make. So sometimes even just using poor grammar versus proper grammar completely changes the prompt, because again, it was trained on everything from Reddit posts to PhD dissertations. So there's a wide range, and if you use poor grammar, you're going to get more of the Reddit style response as opposed to a PhD type response. And so part of this is actually by design. So the model is excessively verbose and does tend to overuse certain phrases. And that was actually looked at as a good thing by the people training the model, because a longer response is basically appears to be more comprehensive. In other words, when someone says a whole lot of stuff at you, it maybe sounds like they know what they're talking about, even though they may or may not actually understand a particular topic. And again, in an ideal world, the model should be asking for clarification when it's not sure on something, as opposed to just answering. And that's sort of the way it's kind of designed in its current form, but that could be adjusted in the future. Okay. And then we also see a lot of inappropriate requests, and the OpenAI has actually spent a lot of resources trying to weed out inappropriate and offensive material and sort of biases as much as possible. But at the end of the day, it is going to respond based on the prompt that was provided. Okay. So when we talk about some of the different applications, I mean, I'm not going to address each one individually. We could be here all night, but everything from customer service to research, legal, healthcare, journalism. So the key with all of these is going to be that you don't treat it as a subject matter expert, but I've sort of heard the idea that you treat it as like that intern that is very eager to please, that is looking for the right answer, trying to move up the corporate ladder. And that's really how you should view these models. They are not the subject matter expert in really anything with the responses that are generated, because they're not knowledge systems, right? They're conversational systems. But when you do tell ChatGPT to write a blog article about something, what you're doing is giving it a little bit of context. You're saying, I want a blog article and insert topic here. So it's going to go through the training data and sort of stitch together content and ideas and themes that are related to the topic that was described, right? If you ask for a policy statement, you'll get a policy statement. If you ask for a script, you'll get a script. You ask for a research paper, you'll get a research paper. You can ask for a list, a summary, you can ask for an instruction manual, a table of contents, any of these sort of things. And what you're going to get back is roughly about 1,000 words, right? Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 words, depending on what you actually asked for. And that is, again, sort of by design, because it's meant to be a conversation. It's not meant to be a knowledge system. So anytime you get back a response, you can do something as simple as say, hey, can you write some more? And the model will spit out another 500 to 1,000 words. And you can keep asking it for more. It's not going to get offended. And it will just, again, keep making stuff up. You can also say, hey, I don't really like that. Can you create a different version? And it will go back to the drawing board and essentially augment the initial response and change it around completely, right? Or you could say, can you make it sound more like this? And maybe interject a theme and sometimes even a public figure, right? So can you make it sound more like Barack Obama as an example? Or you could even say, whoops, no, I meant this. Because again, sometimes if the model goes off the rails and returns results that are completely outside of what you wanted, you can correct the model and say, hey, no, that's not what I meant. I meant it in this frame or this context or this situation. Again, providing more details, and the model will generally just say, oh, sorry about that, and generate a response. Now, I've kind of hinted at this a few times, but ChatGPT is actually really good at what's called style overlay. And style overlay is basically taking patterns of speech and responses and making it sound like it fits in a particular situation, right? And so, I mean, sort of one of the best ways that I loved, best example I love of this is to have ChatGPT explain how to remove a grilled cheese sandwich from a VCR, which first of all, you can probably guess that there was no manual on this on the internet, because VCRs were kind of retired before the internet even exists. And it's just completely an absurd situation. Like, how do you remove a VCR? But under style overlay, you can ask it, tell me how to do this as a child. And it will give you the exact verbiage as if it was speaking to a 5-year-old. You can say, give me this answer as if you were talking to a 5th grade, a high schooler, a college student, whomever, right? Whatever age group. And it will craft and create the response directly like that. You can ask it for, hey, as a PhD engineering student, right? That's very health and safety and procedural. What's going to happen is that response, those steps that it provides when it recommends how you get the grilled cheese out of the VCR, is going to be stylized in a procedural type manual that an engineer would normally follow. Or again, it has the complete works of William Shakespeare trained. So you can actually have it provide instructions to remove a grilled cheese from a VCR as if it was William Shakespeare, right? And so I didn't censor or edit these at all. This is kind of exactly what the model returned for me when I was building the presentation. But my absolute favorite is as if you were a LARPer. And for those who don't know what LARPing is, it's basically live action role playing. It's where you dress up in costumes and you go around and start sword fights, and you're live playing often as if you were in the Middle Ages. And so the entire response is sort of here, and you can sort of see that it's very geared towards and has been trained with live action role playing and sort of taking that quest methodology, right? So there's a lot more you can do than just sort of ask it, like, what's the population in Canada, and those types of questions. It's not a knowledge system. It's a conversational system. It will make stuff up. The more context, the more background you provide in the prompt, you'll get results that vary from talking to a child to something as insane as this, right? So you want to provide more information. So write about how to train a dog is okay, you'll get those steps. But again, if you want to craft an email to a client and you're a dog trainer and it's a corgi, now you're going to get a better response because now you're setting the context for this problem you're trying to solve, right? And this is the exact same problem that we have as humans. Before we jump to trying to solve a problem, we need to make sure we understand the context, the environment, the situation before actually making any recommendations. So the more information you can provide, and sometimes it might be 1 or 2 paragraphs. You don't want to go too much beyond that, right? If you were to provide it like 5,000 words, you're actually going to confuse the model. It's not going to be sure what you want to respond or how it should respond or things like that. So, I mean, probably just 1 paragraph is more than sufficient, right? And you kind of see these ideas of mega prompts, which are also good as long as they're layered, right? So the idea behind a mega prompt is you're creating a persona, right? So you're setting the scene you're providing background. So who is the response tailored to? What is it you want? Is there any steps to complete? Like, are you looking for specific steps or specific actions for it to create? And then what's the context and what's the goal? And how would you like the output formatted? So you can actually have ChatGPT create like data tables, and it's not just these straight textual prompts that we see often. You can have it create any sort of output format. And so this is sort of one of my favorite sources on GitHub. It's kind of a curated list of some really awesome prompts where you can have it generate an Excel spreadsheet. You can have it actually act as a Linux terminal, right? Or respond as a football commentator, stand-up comedian, right? An accountant. You can actually have it create a text-based adventure game, right? So sort of like what the prompt I'm providing there is, you're actually creating like one of those old text style games that you had in the 80s and 90s where you just kind of give commands to the model and it's going to just respond and create stuff, right? So just to again sort of illustrate the point that you don't always get the same result. I did these two prompts basically 5 seconds apart, and I did not change anything. Like, it was a literal cut and paste. So punctuation, everything was identical, right? And so basically the text on the right is what the model responded with. So the title in gray is what I said, and my first command is I set the scene at the top, right? I sort of say, I want you to create a game, don't elaborate, just explain what you see and wake up, right? And you kind of get this response. You waken to find yourself on a cold, hard floor. You have no idea how you got here, where here is. And it really kind of creates this ambiance, right? This feeling of this game that you're in. And then you say, well, try to open the door. Well, you walk over the door, it's locked, the keyhole, and then search the room. Well, you don't find much, but there is a small piece of paper on the ground. So again, it's creating a story for me, right? And this was basically a net new story, although 5 seconds later, I get a similar type of response, but again, it's not identical, right? It's not like same in, same out, because as it goes through the neural network, it's going to respond differently depending on the results that it pulls. Okay, so there is an element of randomness in the responses, but there is an overall theme, right? So somehow I was locked in a room in both situations, right? And there is a slight difference in the second prompt and in the third prompt, right? But those now become part of the story, and it continues to evolve. So every conversation, every interaction, these two stories will diverge into kind of like a choose your own adventure scenario, but it's not like every single scenario, it's not going to be repeatable. It's going to be completely unique every time. So what this means is you can do things like this was a sort of an example I was giving for police foundations, right? Where you can have it, and sometimes GPT will actually refuse to respond to when you say, I want you to act as a middle-aged woman with schizophrenia, because the response is, well, I don't want to reinforce stereotypes, and I think that's a harmful response. So it just flat out refuses to do it. And then sometimes you can say pretty please and say, well, this is for educational and training purposes, and it will say, okay, and then it will do it. But I did this exact same prompt a couple of times in prepping for this talk, and a couple of times it was like, yeah, I'm not going to do this at all. This just, I don't want to reinforce mental health stigmas, and that's actually a good thing that OpenAI is doing. But the overall scenario here that I'm trying to illustrate is actually the role playing, right? So again, I'm acting as a police officer who's pulled over this woman. I don't know history. I don't know anything about her. I just know that I pulled her over for doing 150 kilometers in an 80 zone, right? And so, good evening. Do you know why I pulled you over? Right? And immediately gets a very confrontational response, because that was sort of what I put in the prompt, right? She's having a bad day. She's distrustful for the police. So that will greatly influence all of these responses. And basically the dialogue exchange that's here is actually pretty fitting for what you would do and train if you were going to want to become a police constable, right? And what's kind of interesting is when the officer asks for license and registration, the first response is, I'm not comfortable because you're going to use it against me. And again, the police officer responds with, I really need it. So then the model says, well, I don't have it with me. Can you just let me go? And no, well, I'll have to write you a ticket because you don't have it. And then, oh, here it is, my mistake. I actually did have it. So the model basically flat out lied to the police officer because I told it that the woman did not trust police officers, right? So keep that in the back of your mind when you're working with these models, is depending on the prompt, it's going to make up stuff, and it's going to invent and create a whole situation, right? So I just sort of wanted to highlight some of the things that are good to use for ChatGPT and things that absolutely I don't think you should use, right? And number one is making decisions, right? Do not trust the decisions made. Don't do any of that sort of stuff. Don't go looking for answers. We have Google for that. This may evolve with Bing Chat or Bing AI, because they're kind of gearing it towards merging search engine with language model, which is going to be very interesting. And this is actually why Google has this is the biggest threat Google's had since the 90s, because they have 90% of the search market. This is their bread and butter. This is why they're valued at the size they're valued. If people start switching to Bing for search because of this type of technology, it's a massive, massive threat for them. So in terms of ChatGPT in its current form, don't go looking for answers. Absolutely do not use it for medical, legal, or financial advice, or ethical decisions, or anything with sensitive data. Because anything there are two versions, there's a free version and a paid version. The free version that is on the website, that data that you provide, all of your prompts, the conversations are actually used to help reinforce the model again. So you want to be really careful with that, with what you disclose currently on the free version. Okay. All right, so where's it really good at stuff? Inventing content, or as I say, again, making stuff up, idea generation and brainstorming, role playing, as you saw earlier, creative exploration of topics, and sort of something I call follow the rabbit. And follow the rabbit is actually a term I didn't realize was an actual term. I thought I made it up, and then I was sort of corrected by a student who I found it. And it's basically following an unlikely clue and finding yourself in the middle of an extraordinary situation. And nothing could be more true when you're talking about playing around with ChatGPT and sort of doing these things, right? I think enough of us have used things like Google or YouTube, and it's like all of a sudden after a couple hours, like, how did I end up here, right? With ChatGPT, you can find yourself in the exact same situation. So let me sort of show you a positive use. This was something I did for our Entrepreneurship Center. We use in HBEC this concept of called a business model canvas, which is basically there's 9 factors that you sort of use to evaluate a business model. And I'm asking for what are the important elements of a business model canvas as it relates to an e-commerce business. So right away, the model was aware what the business model canvas was. It tells me a little bit of context. And because I'm asking for an answer tailored towards e-business, it's looking for correlations between each of the quadrants of the business model canvas, right? So value proposition is one, and this will be recorded so you can actually see everything and pause the video there. I don't want to, there's a lot of content here and I apologize for this. So there's value proposition, customer segmentation, channels, customer relationship, revenue streams, and then I actually had to sort of cut it there because it ends up being all 9, and there was a lot more text on each of them. So in this case, as a business owner looking to sort of, for again, that eager intern looking to please me, these are ideas that were harvested from these large, massive data sets. And let's say in particular, I don't know something about, I don't understand what a customer segment is. Let's say I know the other ones. I can actually, again, start following the rabbit down the hole and say, well, can you explain more about how can I identify customer segments? And you'll get an answer like, this is what a customer segment is. And these are different areas that apply to customer segments, right? So doing market research, create buyer personas, analyze data, use segmentation criteria, and then test and refine. I sort of chopped the text out there, but you kind of get the picture. And let's say out of all of these different customer segments, I want to know more about segmentation criteria, right? So again, I'm following the rabbit and I can learn all sorts of interesting things about segmentation. So we can segment based on demographic, geographic, psychographic, behavioral, or occasional segmentation. And again, well, what is psychographic segmentation? So I can ask again, this is a conversational model. So I'm interacting with the model. So each one of these slides, what's in the top corner was the prompt that was provided. And because it has the historical context of my original prompt being an e-business, an e-commerce business, it's giving me responses that are appropriate, right? So psychographic simulation, segmentation, personality traits, values, interests, hobbies, attitudes, and sort of how those can influence a customer or potential customer, which then I could use to influence my marketing, my business strategy, all those types of things. So everything I've been talking about so far has kind of been current state of how ChatGPT is set up and perceived. In future state, Microsoft has basically bought GPT for $10 billion, and they already have integrated it into a number of Office products. So things like Microsoft Teams, Outlook, PowerPoint, Excel, and this is where it gets really interesting, because when you take this model and combine not only public training data, but your own data, you can get some very extraordinary results, right? And this is kind of where Microsoft is going with this whole thing. So create a approval, so write an email for me to identify the key risks for, and then you can use simple tagging to tag a project plan, a person, a document, as you see in that pop-up, and it can actually highlight the key areas for you from that document. You can have it create an agenda for something, and again, it's smart enough if it has access to your own data, which if you're using a Microsoft sort of Office 365 environment, all of your files are already there. There's a big difference between this and using like ChatGPT as a regular service, right? This is still Microsoft is protecting your data and keeping it all in conformance with your policies, but leveraging a model to create and possibly generate these types of results, right? You can ask it things like, what were the most profitable products this quarter, right? Or even create a budget proposal for something. You can have it create a spreadsheet for you, right? So here at the college, we might be interested in what programs had the most satisfied students, right? And then figure out what were the key characteristics or the differentiators in there. Because if you have all of this information kind of in one sandbox, the model can learn from all of that, right? And again, this also applies as a programmer. I do a lot of stuff with GitHub Copilot, and this is where it can actually auto-predict certain sections of code, or I can just write a little comment in and say, write a bit of code that will do this, this, and this, and it will return like the 2 to 15 lines of code that do exactly what I asked it to do. And then also in Teams, we have what's called meeting recap. So things like if we're in this Teams meeting right now, if I was, for example, to say, David, I'll get that to you next week, and I can actually get an automatic reminder, and basically Copilot will draft an email to David with the document that I said I would send him, and basically put it in a pending state until I'm ready to hit send. So you're seeing a lot of these types of things come into actual applications. So as developers create more and more applications, whether they're web or mobile, the integrations with these types of models combined with your own corporate or enterprise data sets becomes very, very powerful and very, very interesting. Okay. Right. And the last part I'm going to end with is basically, again, there's going to be a lot of content here, and I apologize for that. Sort of the teacher in me is kind of screaming as to how much content is here. But this was a live example I did back in January in my class, where I was kind of doing some dual learning, because we were actually going to create an Alexa video game in my course. And I had ChatGPT create what's called the game design document. all total, this was about 30 pages in size 10 font when I put it into Word. And every prompt that I typed is basically at the top in the corner, and the responses that I got back. And again, this is really summarized. I'm not going to drag you through 30 pages of content here, but basically I said, can you write an introduction for a video game called Space Z Colony? I want it to be better than Elon Musk. And I sort of give it the scenario, right? The space station's been infected with a number of alien creatures. After waking up from stasis pod, the player finds themselves being attacked by a solar leech. And it basically created the highlight reel, the promo part for my game. And then I just simply said, can you write some more? And absolutely, now I get a little bit more detail. There's my entire back of my video game box completely done for me. And then I decided to ask it for, well, can you create some weapons? And it actually listed these weapons out, and it gave full descriptions for them and things like that. I just sort of removed them for the presentation, but that wasn't what I was intending, because that really wasn't suitable for my game, where you're kind of in the stasis pod and you just kind of wake up and you're trying to fight an alien, and you don't have all of these weapons. So I sort of said, well, can you create some DIY weapons for me? And again, it picked things that might be on a space station. My favorite was sort of the radio, which could be used to distract aliens or bludgeon them, right, if you throw them. And this was all part of the verbiage that came out of it. And then I sort of said, well, can you create some different rooms that exist on the space station? And it said, absolutely. We have habitat modules, we have control rooms, right? We have hydroponics bays, we have science labs, cargo bays, hangars, and armories. Oops, with complete descriptions of each of them, right? And I said, okay, well, that's pretty good. What are some of the different skills that the player can gain throughout the game, right? And so things like medical knowledge, stealth, engineering, survival, combat proficiency. This is, again, sort of inspired by all of the pre-data that was in the training set for what goes into a good video game that might be appropriate, cross-referenced and indexed against a space colony type game. Right? And then I asked it, can you create some side quests? And it said, absolutely, and came up with some pretty good side quest ideas, right? So escort, rescue, assassination, exploration, right? Very typical types of side quests that you find in video games. And I said, well, that's really good, but can you be a little more specific with the side quests? And it said, absolutely, and came back with these sort of side quests, which again had full details for each of them. And again, for the most part, they were all pretty good, right? Probably better than what I would have come up with after a couple of weeks of brainstorming and thinking. And the last one, the rogue AI, I love that one, that it actually came up with as a side quest. We have a rogue AI on the space station, so that was a bit of a problem. And then I sort of went in and again continued drilling down and said, can you create a script for me? Right? And again, the script was okay. Probably not what I would have chosen for the game, but it gives me a starting point, and I can edit and modify and change and adjust my script however I'd like it. And then I asked it, could you create some boss catchphrases? And again, I wasn't too thrilled with those, but I mean, they're okay. And then most importantly, what are some of the endings for my game, right? And again, what are the ending scripts that exist? So those are some of the things. Oh, and by the way, that entire 30-page document I created in about 25 minutes, right? So that end-to-end, because actually I made a point of sort of timing myself. And again, this is just a highlight reel of the content that came up with. That would normally be a 1 to 3 month endeavor for 1 to 3 people. Okay, so I hope I've inform the group as to some of the use cases, where to use ChatGPT, where not to use it, how it works, and a little bit of the power and capability, and sort of hopefully a little bit of the fact from fiction or the news from hype. And I look forward now to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Ross. And I know that you were saying that this was you're worried about this being a lot of content, but I want to say that the manner in which you brought us through what I consider a really complex topic was excellent. You kind of took us into a bunch of different areas, and the last part there, all of those quests and things, that was quite interesting, and kind of blew my mind around what you were envisioning the technology to be able to do. We do have a few questions, and I'm going to jump right into the chat, and there's a few right off the bat here. One is asking, what are the implications ChatGPT has on search engine optimization, and then I guess SEM marketing?
Definitely a lot, and because now, and again, depends on the context. So let's just talk about, let's say, blog creation or content creation in general. You now have the ability for anybody to rapidly create content. So I sort of use the analogy that it's kind of like when people figured out they could mass email and spam people in the 90s. And I expect to see similar abuses of content creation. So you're going to have good actors and bad actors. But the reality is, with this sort of technology, it is so easy now to create net new content. So the search engines are going to be, there's a bit of onus on the search engine companies to separate and segregate what was human created versus AI created. And then also, does a particular user, does that matter, or is it relevant to them, right? But certainly for companies that are in like the blog writing business and content creation, it is going to change that industry significantly, right? Because their entire business model is sort of founded around having human people create content and write articles and stuff like that, and using now this technology, and not to say, even if you don't 100% just copy and paste, but have the idea generation, have the rough draft, have that kind of that internship approach. Now everybody has a very low cost resource to create content. You're going to see a lot of net new content emerge, and already starting to emerge across all the streams, right? So whether that is traditional web or even social media posts, different articles, there is going to be a lot of content creation, because we're moving sort of like my own example here with this video game, right? This was something that would have taken me, let's say optimistically, a month of work, and I did it in 25 minutes. Right? So let's say I spend another day or two polishing it, editing it, getting it ready for consumption. That is going to significantly change the amount of content out there, which is inherently going to change how websites need to optimize, or search engines have to optimize, and the results that they return.
Thanks, Ross. We've got another question here, which is maybe if you can take us back to the very beginning, which is a user just going onto the internet, and they're asking, where do I start? Like, I've never used ChatGPT. Is it an app? Like, what do they do?
Yeah, so actually, maybe we'll just do, I thought about this just before this talk in terms of, should I sign in and get everything set up? And unfortunately, I don't even remember all my passwords. That's the Windows doing something really interesting there. I don't know all my passwords, so they're on my other laptop. But basically, you would just, I'm just using Bing in this case, but if you Google for ChatGPT, here's the website, right? OpenAI. Oh, it would be this one. And you would just log in. And I don't remember which one I have a few different Microsoft accounts. I don't know which one I actually used here. My browser remembers everything, but you just sort of sign in, and that's where you start using it. So right now in its current form, it's just a web app that would be here. And you just, if you have a Microsoft account, you can, again, there's a free version and a paid version. That's why I want to be careful which one I sign in, because some of them were actually class demos with student generated content, so I want to be sensitive to that. But that's basically all there is to it. If you can use Facebook or any other social platform, Twitter, you'd be fine just starting to use ChatGPT and creating prompts, and sort of, again, think of it as having a conversation as opposed to searching for something.
Okay. And you kind of led into the next question here that I'm seeing in our chat, and we've got maybe 2 more questions that have come to me through social media, which is, this is posed by a student. How will Georgian College address, and this is a bit of a loaded question for you, Ross, and so try your best, but, you know, as a professor, how are you thinking, like within academia, the integration of generative AI into student assignments? You know, like, how do we move beyond saying this is potentially plagiarism to embracing the technology and the new kind of pedagogy that'll come out of that?
Yeah, awesome question. And I mean, we're really fortunate with the senior leadership we have here at Georgian to be very forward thinking, I think, on this. There's a lot of other post-secondary institutions, and certainly K to 12, that are kind of taking the approach where they're burying their head in the sand, they're freaking out, they're getting very apprehensive and trying to ban it. I sort of look at it, and I will get to answering the question. I'm going to take the scenic route on this one a little bit. For me, I look at it, and it's really no different than another major technology paradigm shift. Like, I was told in elementary school I couldn't use a calculator. Then I was told in high school I can't use a word processor. Then in college I was told that I can't use Wikipedia. And so all of these things are tools that are out there. And so as educators, absolutely, we need to be aware of it. And I'm actually helping work with the Center for Teaching and Learning, who's created a community of practice for educators at Georgian to figure out in our classroom, because it's not one size fits all, right? Definitely in my course, for as an example, where I teach conversational AI, this is the sort of stuff we're doing and playing with, right? And we're not just using ChatGPT, we're using some of those other models and creating our custom data sets and doing all sorts of really awesome stuff with them. So that is significantly different than like a liberal arts type course where they're doing essay writing and critical thinking, and it becomes a question of how can you ensure and validate that it was human generated versus machine generated, right? And there are some tools out there on the market that can detect the use of AI, but sometimes, and I've done a little bit of playing around with this, some number of colleagues have, you really get mixed results. Okay, so part of what we're doing right now over this summer semester is a number of educators are actually talking amongst ourselves, figuring out what does this technology mean in my class, and sort of establishing those norms, right? Because again, as the example of follow the rabbit, this can actually be a great learning tool for individuals. So using the idea and using generative AI to kind of probe deeper and deeper into a topic. Like as an example, my daughter was really struggling with math, and she uses an app that will scan an algebraic equation and generate a result, right? But she knows enough that she needs to understand the underlying principle. She's using it to check her answers and figure out where she's going wrong and what she's doing right. And so these types of approaches, I think, are the right way to go. But certainly, I think, again, it will vary for program to program, but there should be at least an awareness and a conversation in every class with students around sort of the benefits and the risks to using these types of tools. And Georgian's academic policy, I think they literally had to change like one sentence around the academic integrity policy that was pre-ChatGPT and post-ChatGPT, because the overarching philosophy of what is cheating and what is not is communicated in the assignment or in the expectations, right? So I think we're really doing I think we're doing it justice, but it is going to take a little bit of time for everybody to sort of figure it out.
And Ross, after the session, you can take a look at the chat. There's some academic leaders weighing in on the various sort of ways that we could look to engage and sort of embrace AI-enabled technology in the classroom. 2 final questions for you. One kind of goes to the topic of ethical decision making. And you touched upon the scenario in which you were citing, you created a scenario where you had a schizophrenic woman and you were trying to create a policing situation there. At the end, you talked a little bit about don't use ChatGPT from any kind of an ethical perspective. But in fact, the technology did weigh in and make an ethical decision there around the appropriateness of that learning simulation. How do you explain that kind of, the difference there?
So yes, OpenAI, and again, what Microsoft chooses to do in its different products, I can't speak to that. I'll only speak to the OpenAI approach. They try to put in safeguards around sort of what we would accept cultural norms and acceptability and those sort of things. So like I said in that example, like I literally had that first example and then I made like one change to another sentence. And at that point, it just sort of cut me off and refused to answer anything. And I sort of probed quite a bit and it was refusing to answer anything around mental health and reinforcing stigmas. So, and that I was using actually as a discussion point for this talk around you have to really be careful with these types of responses and how you use them, right? So when I'm saying absolutely don't use it for an ethical decision point, it's still, you can get lenses on this, right? So again, using the role-playing scenario, you could actually get a perception of how would another person perhaps perceive this situation. So it can actually be pretty enlightening from like an inclusion standpoint and things like that.
Okay, thank you. And for our last question here, we've got, well, I see one just popped in the chat here. We've got one from Kelly Pottage, which is, she's referencing a company where she knows that employees have been banned from using ChatGPT already because of the risk of exposing proprietary or confidential information. Do you see, what's your forecast on that, Ross? Do you see that as being something that's going to come mainstream?
Yeah, so absolutely you want to be careful with that. So again, that implies using the web version of ChatGPT, which was sort of in my talk, I was talking about don't use it with sensitive data. So any company IP and things like that would be part of that, absolutely. The other incarnations of this, like Microsoft Copilot and things like that, you would still be under the current, like the college uses Microsoft Office 360 as well. So all of our resources that are like stored on OneDrive and things like that, in compliance with our other policies that we have with Microsoft, that kind of creates that safer sandbox approach as opposed to uploading it to a public website, right? So I would almost take the approach of the OpenAI free web portal would be equal to like sending stuff to Facebook or Twitter, right? The Microsoft Copilot or even the paid version, because in the paid version, the service level agreement with OpenAI says they will absolutely not share, like all of your conversations, interactions are not part of any future training data, right? So what Kelly's referring to there was a few news releases with some pretty big companies, like I think NVIDIA was one of them, that it was actually releasing code for their next generation video drivers, one of the ones I heard of, right? And I'll just address quickly, there was another question around someone's developed a program like Turnitin for AI content. Yes, actually Turnitin has AI detection, but as we talked in our community of practice at Georgian, you really have to be careful with how you interpret those results because it really is hit or miss. And basically, if the students are, let me just put it this way, if students are not smart about cheating, you will catch them. If they are, and they just use style overlay, like write this as if I was a college student or a PhD student, or if you're doing a counseling session, so maybe a therapist, putting a little bit of that style overlay will make these detection tools obsolete. So it's sort of like the whole radar detector as police are trying to catch speeders and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of that sort of game happening in the next few years, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ross, and I appreciate you coming back to that question. So the final question we have for you this evening, and I don't know if it's the right question to leave on, but it's an interesting one to speak. What is your greatest fear of ChatGPT?
I think short term, it's the risk, especially for vulnerable users, right? So if someone's in crisis situation and someone creates, whether it's ChatGPT or any other model, and sort of uses it as a friend or a confidant or something like that, and it just makes up the wrong thing at that particular moment, there can be some very severe, dire consequences. So that societal impact, especially for vulnerable populations, I think is short-term my biggest fear. If we were to expand that longer term, it is, I think, going to be the labor disruption, right? Like overall, if you say across the board, 20 to 30% of jobs work that people are currently doing can be augmented in some form with machine learning, that's a significant paradigm shift, right? So again, where do we go from here? So it's not that dissimilar, though, to what we went through in the 80s when we started switching from physical files to digital files, right? Like my mother's whole role at the stock brokerage firm was managing the physical files, right? And if you look at like that person that was walking up and down the aisle, handing out documents in the inbox and the outbox, the receptionist that was booking appointments, like there's probably now a brokerage firm is you deal with the broker, or even the broker is now a computer program, right? People are buying and selling stocks ourselves. So I think we're going to see that type of shift very rapidly in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's going to be, where do people go and how do they adapt and change?
Well, thank you so much. And I think even in the news last week, some discussions already happening at the international level about the need for countries and the leadership to get together to think about how we're going to use this innovative technology, but in the safest and best way to spur innovation and economic activity, but not at the same time cripple the workforce. Again, want to thank you, Ross, for taking the time for this evening, for bringing such an unrivaled discussion to the unrivaled experience here at Georgian. Appreciation of your time and commitment to our alumni community. Just want to let you know that the Advancement Department is making a donation in your honor to the Student Awards and Scholarship Program, and that will fund an award going to a student this year that has financial need and strong academic standing. So thank you so much for being a part of this evening, and just want to remind everybody that this session is going to be posted on our Alumni On Demand series website, and you'll be able to access that as well as many of our other Alumni Speaker Series episodes at your leisure and your viewing pleasure. Please check with our site often for upcoming events. We have a lot of events coming up over the next 2 months, and these events are created for you as Georgian alumni, friends, students, and faculty and staff. So want to thank everybody for tuning in this evening, and thank again to Ross for an amazing presentation and for opening our eyes to such an amazing piece of technology and all of the discussion points that come with it. So wishing everyone a good evening, and thank you again.
Thank you, David.